The City of London does not wake up in silence. It wakes up in a roar. Imagine you are standing on a cobblestone street in the late winter of 1664. The air is thick, not just with fog, but with the smoke of 50,000 chimneys. You hear the iron wheels of carts grinding against stone. You hear the shouts of merchants selling oysters, coal, and fabric. It is a symphony of commerce. London is the beating heart of trade, a city that never stops moving, never stops shouting, and, most importantly, never stops talking. But if you listen closely, underneath the roar of the market, there is a new sound. It is quieter than a shout, but it travels faster. It is a whisper, and this whisper is about to change everything. Welcome to the London Gritty Chronicles. Today, we are not just looking at a disease. We are looking at something that moves faster than any infection. We are tracking the speed of fear. We are going to examine how rumors start, how informal messengers carry them, and how humans invent explanations to feel a sense of control when the world falls apart. Along the way, you will learn a very specific skill in English: how to use cautious language. You will learn how to report claims, how to add distance to your sentences, and how to avoid overstatement when narrating a crisis. Let us return to that street in late 1664. The mood is tense. Two men sit in a coffee house near the Royal Exchange. Coffee houses in the 17th century were not just places to drink caffeine. They were the internet of their day. This is where news was shared, debated, and often distorted. One man leans in. He lowers his voice. He claims he has received a letter from Holland. "They say," he whispers, "that the sickness has returned to Amsterdam." Notice that phrase, "they say." In English, this is a classic marker of hearsay. Hearsay is information received from other people that one cannot adequately substantiate. It is a rumor. The man does not say, "The plague is in Amsterdam." That would be a definitive statement of fact. Instead, he uses the distancing phrase, "they say." This is your first lesson in cautious English. When you are describing a situation where the facts are uncertain, you must create distance between yourself and the claim. You are not reporting the truth. You are reporting the possibility of truth. The rumor from Holland was terrifying because Londoners remembered the past. They knew that if the plague was in the Dutch ports, it would soon be on the English ships. But for months, it remained just that, a rumor, a shadow on the horizon. Then, the whisper crossed the water. In the parish of St. Giles in the Fields, just outside the city walls, a sudden death occurred. It was December. The winter was cold, the ground was hard, and two men died unexpectedly. The official records, known as the Bills of Mortality, listed their death simply, but the neighbors began to talk. The English word alleged is powerful here. It means something is said to have happened, but has not yet been proven. It was alleged that these men had the tokens, the distinctive black spots of the plague, on their chests. But the authorities were silent. Why? Because fear is bad for business. If the city admits the plague has arrived, the port closes. The ships stop. The money stops. So, the official story remained calm, but the unofficial story began to sprint through the city. This brings us to the mechanics of how fear travels. In 1665, there were no telephones, no radios, no internet. Yet a story could cross London in a single afternoon. How? Through informal messengers, servants, water carriers, and market sellers. These were the people who moved between the wealthy houses and the crowded slums. They carried water, they carried food, and they carried stories. Imagine a servant hearing a fragment of conversation at the market. "The baker in Drury Lane has fallen ill." She takes this fragment back to her master's kitchen. By the time she tells the cook, the story has changed. Now it is not just the baker, it is the baker and his whole family. And they didn't just fall ill, they were boarded up in their house. In English, we call this embellishment. To embellish means to make a story more interesting or entertaining by adding extra details, often details that are not true. Fear thrives on embellishment. When we are afraid, our minds fill in the gaps. We want to know how bad it is, so we invent details to match our anxiety. By the spring of 1665, the weather began to warm. In biology, warmth encourages bacteria to multiply. But in society, warmth encourages people to congregate, to meet, to travel. The biology and the sociology were working together to create a disaster. The official government response was slow. The king and his court were hesitant to cause panic. They used language that minimized the threat. They spoke of spotted fever or violent ague, avoiding the terrifying word plague. This is a strategy we see throughout history, the use of euphemism. A euphemism is a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt. Calling the plague a fever is a euphemism. It is a verbal shield. But the people knew better. You cannot hide the smell of death, and you cannot hide the sound of the passing bell. In English parishes, when someone died, a bell was rung. It was a slow, mournful toll. 1 ring for a child, perhaps. 3 for a man. In April 1665, the bells in the outer parishes began to ring more frequently. This auditory signal cut through the euphemisms. The government could publish all the calm reports it wanted, but the bells were telling a different story. This disconnect between official words and sensory reality creates a vacuum, and into that vacuum rushes the rumor. Let's look at how you can describe this using cautious reporting verbs. Instead of saying, "the government lied," which is strong and accusatory, a historian might say, "It appears that the authorities downplayed the severity of the crisis." Downplayed means to make something appear less important than it really is. "It appears that" softens the accusation. Or consider this sentence. Reports circulate that the death toll is higher than recorded. Circulate implies movement, like blood in the body or coins in an economy. Rumors circulate. By May, the distance between the rumor and the reality collapsed. The bills of mortality, the weekly death lists printed on sheets of paper and pinned up in the city, showed a sharp increase. The term plague began to appear in the columns. The whisper had become a shout. People began to look for explanations. Why now? Why us? In the 17th century, science was competing with superstition. If you cannot see the germ, which they could not, as the microscope was still a novelty, and the germ theory of disease was centuries away, you must invent a cause. Was it the comet that had been seen in the sky months before? Was it a punishment from God for the sins of the city? Was it the result of bad air or miasma rising from the filth of the streets? These explanations are psychological anchors. They give people a way to frame their fear. If it is bad air, you can hold a handkerchief to your face. If it is God's wrath, you can pray. If it is a comet, you can wait for it to pass. The most terrifying thing for the human mind is a threat with no cause and no solution. As we move deeper into this story, we will see how these explanations drove people to extreme actions. We will see how the City of London, usually so united by trade, began to fracture. Neighbors began to watch neighbors with suspicion. The informal messengers who once carried news were now seen as carriers of death. But before the panic fully takes hold, we must understand the system of detection. Who decided if a person had died of the plague? It was not a doctor. It was not a scientist. It was a group of people often overlooked by history, yet they held the power of life and death over a household. They were called the Searchers. And their story is where the true horror of misinformation begins. Who decides if you are sick? In our modern world, we imagine a doctor in a white coat looking at a screen, backed by years of medical school. We imagine tests, labs, and cold, hard data. But in 1665 London, the person who decided the fate of your family was likely an elderly, illiterate woman holding a white wooden wand. They were known as the Searchers of the Dead, and their role in this story reveals a terrifying truth. During a crisis, data is often just as sick as the people. The system worked like this. When someone died in a London parish, the church would send 2 women, searchers, to examine the body. These women were usually poor, often widows living on charity. They had no medical training. They were sent into the dark, infected rooms to look for the signs, the swelling of the lymph nodes, buboes, or the telltale spots, tokens. They would then report their findings to the parish clerk, who would add the number to the weekly bills of mortality. Imagine the scene. A wealthy merchant's son has died. The house is silent, gripped by terror. If the searchers report plague, the authorities will come. They will nail the door shut. They will paint a red cross on the timber. They will write, "Lord, have mercy upon us," above the threshold. And every living person inside, the merchant, his wife, the servants, will be trapped with the dead body for 40 days. It is a death sentence. But the searchers are poor, and the merchant is rich. A coin is slipped into a hand, a gold sovereign perhaps, a whispered plea. Surely it was only the spotted fever. Surely it was a consumption. The searchers take the coin. They walk out to the clerk, and they report, "Spotted fever." This brings us to a crucial English concept: corruption. In this context, corruption does not just mean rotting flesh. It means dishonest conduct by those in power, typically involving bribery. The data itself became corrupted. The official numbers, the very things people were reading to understand their safety, were lies born of survival. When you are describing history or even modern news, you often need to discuss the reliability of information. Use the verb to verify. To verify means to make sure that something is true, accurate, or justified. Historians cannot verify the exact death toll because the records were flawed. The clerk failed to verify the searcher's report. Because the rich could afford to bribe the searchers, the official records in the early months of 1665 showed a strange pattern. Deaths from other causes skyrocketed, while plague deaths remained low. People were dying, but the paper said they were safe. This false sense of security allowed the disease to spread deeper, wider, and faster. It creates a situation we can describe with the phrase, a false sense of security. This is a feeling of being safer than you actually are. It is a dangerous state of mind. By June, however, the bribery could no longer hide the reality. The piles of bodies were becoming too large to explain away as fever. The summer heat descended on the city, baking the sewage in the streets, incubating the fleas on the rats. The smell of London changed. It became the smell of sickness. And then, the city fractured. Fear does not affect everyone equally. It travels along the lines of class and money. As the rumors solidified into fact, the wealthy did what the wealthy have always done in history. They ran. It started with the lawyers and the doctors, then the merchants, and finally, the royal court itself. King Charles II and his entourage packed their carriages and fled to the countryside, seeking the clean air of Oxford and Salisbury. They had the means to escape. They had horses, country estates, and money. Describe this movement with the word exodus. An exodus is a mass departure of people. There was a mass exodus of the wealthy from the city. But watch how we report this. We do not say, "The king was a coward." That is emotional and judgmental. In documentary storytelling, we use more neutral, observational language. We might say, "The king's departure signaled to the common people that the city was no longer safe." Signaled implies a message was sent without words. For the poor, there was no exodus. They were the bakers, the butchers, the water carriers, and the servants. They lived paycheck to paycheck, or rather, day to day. If they didn't work, they didn't eat. They could not leave. They were tethered to the city by poverty. This created a volatile atmosphere. The people left behind felt abandoned. The social contract, the unwritten agreement that the leaders will protect the people, was breaking. You could hear it in the angry shouts on the street corners. You could see it in the way people looked at the empty mansions of the rich, now locked up and silent. A specific document became the most valuable piece of paper in England: the Certificate of Health. To travel past the city limits, to enter a village in the countryside, you needed this paper signed by the Lord Mayor, proving you came from a plague-free house. Without it, country villagers would meet you with pitchforks and stones. They were terrified of the Londoners. They saw them not as refugees, but as biological weapons. Here we see fear turning outward. The rural communities were skeptical of outsiders. To be skeptical is to not easily be convinced, to have doubts or reservations. The villagers were skeptical of the travelers' claims. Note the preposition, skeptical of. You are skeptical of a plan, of a person, or of a claim. Back in the city, the Lord Mayor stayed. To his credit, while the king left, the mayor and the aldermen, the city council, remained to enforce order. And the order they enforced was brutal. They invoked the Plague Orders of 1578. These orders changed the very geography of the city. London was no longer a network of open streets. It became a prison system. If one person in a house showed signs of infection, the entire house was sealed. Imagine the sound of the hammer. Bang, bang, bang. Iron padlocks were snapped onto the outside of doors. Watchmen were stationed in the street day and night to ensure no one entered or left. Food was passed up in baskets to upper windows. The people inside were alive, but they were already treated as dead. This policy was controversial even then. People argued that locking the healthy in with the sick was murder. They called it a death sentence. But the authorities argued it was necessary for the greater good. This phrase, the greater good, is a powerful tool in English rhetoric. It is often used to justify harsh actions that hurt a few people to help many. But in 1665, for the family locked in the dark with a dying father, the greater good felt like a cold execution. As June turned to July, the heat intensified. The noise of the city began to fade. The carts stopped. The shouts died down. The only sound that grew louder was the tolling of the bells. And then, the authorities made a decision that would turn the silence into terror. They decided that the bells were making people too sad. They were hurting morale. So, they banned the bells. But silence, as we will see, is sometimes louder than noise. Silence is usually peaceful. In a forest, silence means tranquility. In a library, silence means concentration. But in the summer of 1665, the silence of London was heavy. It was a scream held in the throat. When the authorities banned the tolling of church bells to stop the panic, they removed the city's voice. But they could not remove its eyes, and what the eyes saw was red. As the auditory signals vanished, the visual signals took over. Paint. Red ochre paint. Every morning, citizens would wake up and look down their street. They were looking for the Red Cross. It was a crude mark, roughly a foot high, painted on the door of any house known to be infected. The words were chalked or painted, "Lord, have mercy upon us." This was not just a prayer. It was a legal notification. It was a label that transformed a home into a prison. This brings us to a useful English adjective, draconian. We use this word to describe laws or measures that are excessively harsh or severe. The city implemented draconian measures to stop the spread. It comes from Draco, an ancient Athenian lawgiver known for his severity. Locking a healthy family inside a house with a dying relative was, by any definition, a draconian measure. To enforce these draconian rules, the city hired men known as watchmen. To enforce means to compel observance of a law, rule, or obligation. The police enforced the speed limit. The watchmen enforced the quarantine. The watchmen were the guards of the infected. They stood outside the locked houses, one by day and one by night. Their job was simple: make sure no one leaves. They held halberds, long poles with axe heads, and they had the authority to use force. They were the visible agents of the city's fear. But here is where the biology of the virus and the sociology of the city mirror each other. In a body, the immune system sends white blood cells to attack an invader. In the city, the watchman was sent to contain the infection. However, just as an immune system can sometimes attack the body itself, the watchmen often became a danger to the people they were supposed to protect. Many watchmen were poor, desperate men. They were often illiterate and easily bribed. If a wealthy family was locked inside, they might lower a bag of coins from a window. The watchman would look the other way. The family would slip out the back, climb over a garden wall, and disappear into the night, carrying the infection with them. We call this a breach. A breach is an act of breaking or failing to observe a law, agreement, or code of conduct. There was a security breach at the gate. The family breached the quarantine. As July turned into August, the heat became unbearable. The narrow streets of London, lined with timber-framed houses that leaned toward each other, trapped the air. The smells of the city, garbage, unwashed bodies, rotting food, intensified, and the red crosses multiplied. People began to avoid the main streets. They walked in the middle of the road to avoid touching the walls of houses. They held pomanders, balls of aromatic substances like spices and herbs, to their noses. They believed that the plague was airborne, carried by miasma, or bad air. This belief in miasma drove behavior. If you believe the air is poison, you try to filter it. You smoke tobacco. You chew garlic. You burn brimstone, sulfur, in your fireplace, even in the summer heat, hoping the sharp smoke will purify the air. To purify means to remove contaminants from. They boiled the water to purify it. They burned herbs to purify the room. But while they were purifying the air, the real enemy was on the ground. The rat flea, Xenopsilla chiopis. It was living in the straw on the floors, in the bedding, in the warehouses. The people were fighting the air, but the death was jumping from their ankles. This disconnect between the perceived threat, bad air, and the actual threat, fleas, created a market for misinformation. When people are terrified, and the official explanations, like God's wrath, feel insufficient, they turn to experts who promise a solution. And in 1665, London was full of people ready to sell a solution. They were called quacks. A quack is a fraudulent or ignorant pretender to medical skill. A person who dishonestly claims to have special knowledge and skill in some field, typically medicine. He is a quack doctor selling fake medicine. The streets were suddenly filled with posters and flyers. Infallible remedies. The royal antidote. Plague water. These charlatans promised that for a few shillings you could buy a powder or a potion that would make you immune. Notice the word infallible. It means incapable of making mistakes or being wrong. He claimed his cure was infallible. Of course, in science and history, almost nothing is infallible. But fear makes people desperate to believe. The quacks sold dried toad powder. They sold amulets with abracadabra written on them. They sold unicorn horn, which was likely ground-up bone or ivory. And the people bought it. They spent their last savings on these useless cures because having a bottle of plague water in your pocket felt like having control. It is a psychological truth. Action feels better than inaction. Even if the action is useless, it reduces anxiety. So, as the death toll climbed from hundreds to thousands per week, the city was caught in a cycle of draconian enforcement and desperate superstition. The watchmen watched the doors, the people watched the air, and the quacks watched their profits rise. But deep in the crowded parishes of St. Giles and Cripplegate, the social fabric was tearing. The poor were dying in such numbers that the individual burial was becoming impossible. The rituals of grief, the coffin, the procession, the prayers, were about to be abandoned. The city was running out of space. And when a city runs out of space for the dead, the rules of civilization begin to break down completely. When a society functions normally, death has a name. It has a ritual. A coffin, a prayer, a stone. But in August 1665, the names disappeared. London became a city of numbers. The churchyards were full. The ground was so packed with bodies that the surface level of the earth actually rose, swelling like a bruise. The smell was inescapable. So, the authorities made a grim decision. They stopped digging graves for individuals. They started digging pits for the multitude. This shift marks a terrifying moment in any crisis. The moment when the individual becomes a statistic. The nights in London were no longer silent. They were filled with the rumble of heavy wheels and the ringing of a handbell. Not the church bell, that was banned, but the harsh, clanging bell of the dead cart. "Bring out your dead! Bring out your dead!" This was the cry of the carters. These men were often drunk, fortified with cheap spirits to numb the horror of their job. They walked alongside carts piled high with bodies. There were no coffins. There were no shrouds. The rich and the poor were thrown together, their limbs tangled, stripped of their clothes and their dignity. In English, we use the word indiscriminate to describe this. Indiscriminate means done at random or without careful judgment. The plague was indiscriminate. It took the young and the old, the rich and the poor. The carters threw the bodies into the pit in an indiscriminate heap. The destination for these carts was the plague pit. These were massive trenches dug in the fields outside the city walls or in the corners of overflowing churchyards. The most famous was perhaps the Great Pit at Aldgate. It was described as a gulf rather than a grave. Historical accounts suggest, notice the cautious phrasing, suggest, that some pits were 20 feet deep and could hold over 1,000 bodies. People were terrified of them. Not just because of the disease, but because of the anonymity. To be thrown into a pit was to be forgotten. It was to be erased from history. Here is a useful word for describing the size of a disaster. Magnitude. Magnitude refers to the great size or extent of something. The magnitude of the crisis overwhelmed the city officials. They could not comprehend the magnitude of the death toll. As the magnitude of the death toll rose to over 6,000 people per week, the social order began to dissolve. The watchmen we spoke of earlier, many of them died. The searchers, they died too. The system of control was being eaten by the very thing it was trying to contain. This created a vacuum of power. A vacuum is a space entirely devoid of matter. In politics or sociology, a power vacuum is a situation where there is no identifiable central authority. When the mayor fell ill, it created a dangerous power vacuum. Into this vacuum stepped a new kind of fear, the fear of the living. With the watchmen dying or fleeing, the quarantine houses were often left unguarded. People broke out. But where could they go? The countryside was hostile. The city was a graveyard. So they roamed the streets. Some were delirious with fever. Accounts from the time describe people running naked through the streets, screaming at hallucinations caused by high fever. Others were melancholic, wandering in silent despair. We use the word unprecedented to describe events that have never happened before. The scale of the suffering was unprecedented in London's history. The government took unprecedented steps to control the population. This unprecedented suffering broke the usual rules of behavior. People stopped avoiding each other because there was no point. If the air was poison, you were already dead. If the fleas were everywhere, you couldn't hide. A strange fatalism took over. Fatalism is the belief that all events are predetermined and therefore inevitable. A sense of fatalism spread through the population. They stopped trying to escape. But amidst this fatalism, a different kind of story began to circulate. A story not about death, but about blame. When humans suffer on this scale, they need a villain. They need someone to point at. We saw earlier how the poor blamed the rich for leaving. Now the anger turned toward foreigners, the Dutch specifically. England was at war with the Dutch Republic during this time, the Second Anglo-Dutch War. It was easy to whisper that the plague was not just a disease, but a weapon, a plot. Rumors circulated that the Dutch had poisoned the wells. It was alleged that spies were spreading the infection intentionally. These rumors were almost certainly false. But in a time of unprecedented fear and indiscriminate death, the truth is often the first casualty. The informal messengers, the gossip in the alehouses, the whispers in the markets, began to carry stories of sabotage. This is a critical lesson in both history and language. Crisis accelerates the search for a scapegoat. A scapegoat is a person or group who is blamed for the wrongdoings, mistakes, or faults of others. The foreigners became a convenient scapegoat for the city's suffering. As September approached, the death toll reached its peak. The Great Pit at Aldgate was full. They had to throw earth over it to keep the smell down. The city was on the brink of total collapse. There was no trade, no manufacturing, no law. Just the bell, the cart, and the pit. But then, just as the city seemed ready to expire, the sky changed. The wind shifted, and a new element entered the story. Not a cure, but a force of nature that would begin to turn the tide. However, before the relief could come, London had to endure its darkest week. The week when the bills of mortality admitted the impossible number, 7,165 deaths in 7 days. And even that number, historians agree, was a lie. The real number was likely double. The number on the paper was 7,165. That was the official count of the dead for the third week of September. But in history, as in modern news, the official number is rarely the whole story. Historians and demographers now believe the true number was much higher, perhaps 10,000, perhaps 12. Why the difference? Because the system of counting had collapsed. In English, we call this a discrepancy. A discrepancy is a lack of compatibility or similarity between two or more facts. There was a huge discrepancy between the official report and the eyewitness accounts. The discrepancy in the numbers suggests the crisis was worse than admitted. The discrepancy existed because the bills of mortality only counted those buried in the Church of England graveyards. But London was a diverse city. It was home to Quakers, Jews, and Anabaptists. When they died, they were often buried in gardens or fields, unrecorded by the parish clerks. They were the invisible dead. To describe this, we use the verb to understate. To understate means to describe something as less important or smaller than it really is. The government understated the death toll to prevent panic. The report significantly understates the magnitude of the disaster. By late September, the city had reached its peak. To peak means to reach the highest point, either of a mountain or of a trend. The infection rate peaked in late summer. At this peak, the psychological state of the city shifted again. We have seen fear, we have seen panic, and we have seen blame. Now we see something even more dangerous. Desensitization. Desensitization is the process of becoming less sensitive to something, usually through repeated exposure. After months of seeing the carts, the people became desensitized to the horror. The diaries of the time, most notably from Samuel Pepys, show this clearly. In the beginning, Pepys was terrified by a single funeral. By September, he writes about stepping over bodies in the street with a chilling casualness. He was not a bad man. He was just a human being whose capacity for shock had been exhausted. This desensitization changed how people spoke. The frantic rumors of June were replaced by a grim acceptance. Grim is a very useful adjective. It means depressing, uninviting, or forbidding. The outlook for the city was grim. They faced the grim reality of the coming winter. In this grim atmosphere, the social structures that held families together began to disintegrate. Throughout history, the family unit is usually the strongest bond. But the plague tested this bond to its breaking point. There are accounts of parents abandoning children, and children abandoning parents, fleeing the house at the first sign of a sneeze. And the phrase, "every man for himself," is often used to describe this survival instinct. It means that people are trying to save themselves and are not helping others. However, just as the city seemed to be losing its humanity, the biology of the disease began to interact with the environment. The fall equinox arrived. The winds changed. The temperature dropped. In biology, the flea population is sensitive to weather. Cold air slows them down. It kills the larvae. As the nights grew longer and colder in October, the frenetic reproduction of the bacteria slowed. The peak had passed, though the people on the ground didn't know it yet. They only knew that the bells were ringing slightly less often. The mounds of earth in the pits were being covered over. But notice how cautious we must be when describing the end of a crisis. It rarely ends all at once. It subsides. To subside means to become less intense, violent, or severe. The floodwaters began to subside. The panic subsided as the death toll dropped. As the plague subsided, the wealthy began to return. But they did not return to the same city. The London they came back to was different. It was quieter. It was emptier. And it was filled with survivors. A survivor is not just someone who didn't die. In this context, it is someone who has lived through a traumatic event and carries the memory of it. The survivors of 1665 were suspicious. They were hardened, and they were looking for meaning. Why did they survive when their neighbors died? Was it luck? Was it God? Or was it something else? This search for meaning led to a surge in religious fervor. The churches that had been empty during the contagion were now full. But the mood was not one of gratitude. It was one of reckoning. Reckoning is a time when one is called to account for one's actions. The city faced a reckoning after the war. They believed the plague was a reckoning for their sins. And while the people prayed, the rats, the true vectors of the disease, retreated into the walls and the cellars. They were still there. The bacteria, Yersinia pestis, was still there. It was merely dormant. Dormant means having normal physical functions suspended or slowed down for a period of time, in or as if in a deep sleep. The virus lay dormant for the winter. The City of London thought the worst was over. They began to rebuild their lives. They opened the shops. They lit the fires. But they did not know that the conditions for a different kind of disaster were being laid. The dry timber of the houses, the packed warehouses of oil and pitch, and the narrow, crowded streets were waiting for a spark. The plague had killed the people, but it had left the buildings standing, and the buildings were hungry for fire. February 1666. The king returned. When Charles II rode back into Whitehall, it was a signal. In the 17th century, the monarch was not just a political leader. He was the sun around which the society orbited. If the king was back, the city was safe. Or so they wanted to believe. The return of the court brought colour back to the grey streets. The theatres reopened, the taverns filled with smoke and laughter. There was a desperate energy to the city. After a year of silence and death, London wanted to scream that it was alive. We use the word resilience to describe this. Resilience is the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties. Toughness. The resilience of the city was remarkable. London showed great resilience in the face of disaster. But resilience can sometimes look like denial. While the wealthy were buying new silks and throwing parties, the poor in the outer parishes were still dying. The plague had not vanished. It had merely retreated. It was still lurking in the shadows of the slums, claiming a few victims here, a few victims there. This creates a situation we call a disparity. A disparity is a great difference. There was a huge disparity between the joy of the court and the suffering of the poor. The economic disparity widened after the crisis. In history and in storytelling, it is important to capture these contradictions. A city can be celebrating and mourning at the exact same time. The spring of 1666 was strange. The fear of the disease had been replaced by a different kind of anxiety. Economic anxiety. The trade had been decimated. The ports had been closed for so long that ships were rotting at anchor. Merchants were desperate to make up for lost time. This desperation led to a phrase we still use today: business as usual. This means an ongoing and unchanging state of affairs despite difficulties or disturbances. Despite the lingering cases of plague, the king wanted to return to business as usual. But business as usual in 1666 meant ignoring the safety protocols that had saved lives just months before. The quarantines were relaxed. The watchmen were dismissed. The red crosses were scrubbed off the doors. Why? Because fear is expensive. Maintaining a state of high alert costs money and stops trade. So the city collectively decided to turn a blind eye. To turn a blind eye is an idiom meaning to pretend not to notice. The authorities turned a blind eye to the new cases in the slums. As the weather warmed up again in May and June of 1666, a new fear began to travel through the whispers of the city. What if it comes back? What if the summer brings the second wave? In epidemiology and history, a resurgence is an increase or revival after a period of little activity. They feared a resurgence of the virus. The doctors warned of a potential resurgence. To combat this fear, the people did not turn to science, which had failed them, or to the government, which had abandoned them. They turned to fate. They adopted a mindset of cautious optimism. Tentative is a great word here. It means not certain or fixed, provisional. The recovery was tentative. They made tentative plans for the summer. But nature had a different plan. The summer of 1666 was not just warm, it was hot, exceptionally hot, and it was dry. A drought descended on England. The wooden timbers of the houses, already old and brittle, began to dry out completely. The thatch on the roofs became like tinder. The warehouses along the Thames were packed with combustible goods: oil, tallow, animal fat for candles, hemp, pitch, and alcohol. Combustible means able to catch fire and burn easily. The warehouse was full of combustible materials. The city was drying out. It was becoming a giant wooden trap. And the people were too busy trying to make money, too busy trying to forget the horror of the plague, to notice the new danger rising. They were looking down at the ground, watching for rats. They should have been looking at the wood. In English, we often talk about hindsight. Hindsight is understanding of a situation or event only after it has happened or developed. In hindsight, the danger was obvious. With the benefit of hindsight, we can see the mistakes they made. In hindsight, we know that London in the summer of 1666 was the most dangerous place on earth, not because of a germ, but because of physics. The informal messengers we spoke of earlier, the servants and water carriers, began to complain about the water supply. The wells were running low. The wooden pipes that carried water to the city were dry. And yet, the city continued to pack itself tighter. New buildings were thrown up to replace the old ones. The jetties, the upper floors of houses that stuck out over the street, were built so close that you could shake hands with your neighbor across the street from the top floor. This architecture meant that air could not circulate while at street level, bad for the plague, but fire could jump easily from roof to roof, bad for the future. The stage was set. The biology of 1665 had killed the people. The physics of 1666 was coming for their homes. And it would start with a simple mistake. A baker, a Sunday morning, and a small flickering flame that would travel faster than any rumor. A spark is smaller than a rat, but it travels faster. In the early hours of Sunday, September 2nd, 1666, the city of London was sleeping off a Saturday night. The baker, Thomas Fariner, in his shop on Pudding Lane, believed he had put out the fire in his oven. He was wrong. This is a classic example of human error. Error is a mistake. Human error suggests that the mistake was not malicious, but simply a result of being human. Historians attribute the start of the disaster to human error. The fire did not stay in the oven. It crept onto the floor. It found a pile of kindling. It found the dry wooden walls. By 1 a.m., the house was full of smoke. Fariner and his family woke up coughing. We did not run out the front door. The stairs were already burning. They had to climb out of a window and scramble over the gutter to the neighbor's roof. They survived, but their maid was too afraid to jump. She became the first victim of what history would call the Great Fire. Now, watch how the system reacts. Just as with the plague, the first reaction to the fire was denial. The neighbors woke up, saw the smoke, and thought, "It is just a small fire. It will be out soon." In English, we call this complacency. Complacency is a feeling of smug or uncritical satisfaction with oneself or one's achievements. It is a dangerous state of calm. Their complacency led them to ignore the warning signs. The city's complacency regarding fire safety was fatal. The local constables arrived. They saw the danger. They suggested pulling down the neighboring houses to create a fire break. A fire break is a gap that stops a fire from spreading. They demolished the row of shops to create a fire break. But to pull down a house requires authority. You are destroying property. So, they sent for the Lord Mayor, Thomas Bloodworth. When Bloodworth arrived, the fire was still relatively small. He looked at it. He looked at the expensive houses he would have to destroy to stop it. And he made a decision that would doom the city. He famously dismissed the fire. To dismiss means to treat something as unworthy of serious consideration. He dismissed the danger. The mayor dismissed the constable's advice. According to historical records, Bloodworth said, "Pish! A woman might piss it out." This crude phrase shows his absolute confidence and his absolute ignorance. He went back to bed. But while the mayor slept, the wind woke up. A strong easterly gale began to blow. It pushed the flames from Pudding Lane down toward the river. And what was by the river? Warehouses. The warehouses were full of oil, spirits, and coal. The fire hit the warehouses like a bomb. It exploded. We use the word inferno to describe a large fire that is dangerously out of control. The warehouse turned into a raging inferno. The firefighters could not contain the inferno. By Sunday morning, the fire was no longer a local accident. It was a monster. It was moving west, eating the city street by street. And here is where the speed of fear overtakes the speed of the fire. The citizens of London saw the smoke. They felt the heat. And just like in the plague year, they began to pack. But this time, they couldn't lock themselves in. They had to get out. The streets became clogged with carts, horses, and people carrying their most valuable possessions. Diaries from the time describe a chaotic river of furniture moving away from the flames. People were carrying virginals, musical instruments, tables, and beds on their backs. And as they ran, they talked. The rumors began to fly. Remember, England was at war with the Dutch and the French. The people did not believe a simple baker could cause this much destruction. They needed a villain. A villain is a character whose evil actions or motives are important to the plot. They searched for a villain to blame for the fire. The whisper started. "It is the Dutch. It is the French. They are throwing fireballs into the houses." This is a perfect example of hysteria. Hysteria is exaggerated or uncontrollable emotion or excitement, especially among a group of people. Mass hysteria took hold of the crowd. The rumors fed the hysteria. Foreigners in London were suddenly in danger. A mob attacked a Swedish diplomat because they thought his box of diplomatic papers was a box of grenades. A French woman was assaulted because people thought the chicks in her apron, baby chickens, were fireballs. The fear of the enemy within traveled faster than the fire itself. The city guard, instead of fighting the fire, had to spend time protecting foreigners from the English mob. This shows us a tragic irony. Irony is a state of affairs or an event that seems deliberately contrary to what one expects. It was a tragic irony that the people were fighting each other instead of the fire. By Sunday night, the fire had consumed the approach to London Bridge. It was heading for the heart of the city, the Royal Exchange and the great St. Paul's Cathedral. St. Paul's was the spiritual centre of London. It was massive, made of ancient stone. The people believed it was invincible. Invincible means too powerful to be defeated or overcome. They thought the stone cathedral was invincible. Because they thought it was safe, the booksellers and merchants of London moved their stocks into the cathedral crypts and the churchyard. They stacked thousands of books, papers, and cloths inside the holy walls, believing God and stone would protect them. But they had forgotten one thing about stone. Stone does not burn, but it cracks under heat. And the roof of St. Paul's was made of lead, and the scaffolding around it, because it was being renovated, was made of wood. As the sun set on Sunday, the sky over London was not dark. It was a glowing, terrifying orange. The roar of the fire was so loud it sounded like 1,000 thunderstorms. And the heat was so intense that people on the boats in the middle of the Thames had to splash water on their faces to keep their skin from blistering. The mayor was nowhere to be found. The king was watching from the river, realizing that his capital was disappearing. And the rumors kept spreading.
The pipes are cut. The water is poisoned. The king has abandoned us.
The city was facing a catastrophe. Catastrophe is an event causing great and often sudden damage or suffering, a disaster. The fire was a catastrophe for the economy. They could not prevent the catastrophe. As Monday dawned, the fire did not stop. It grew. It created its own weather system. The heat rose, sucking in fresh air from the streets, creating a vacuum that pulled the fire forward even faster. This is known as a firestorm. And in the path of the firestorm stood the great, invincible St. Paul's Cathedral, filled with the city's books. The stage was set for the greatest loss of history and literature England had ever seen. The people watched, helpless, as the flames began to lick the scaffolding. They were about to learn that in a crisis of this magnitude, there is no such thing as a safe place. Stone explodes. We tend to think of stone as solid, permanent, and unchangeable. But in the heat of Tuesday, September 4th, 1666, the stones of St. Paul's Cathedral did not just crack, they detonated. The heat inside the firestorm had reached over 1,000 degrees Celsius. The moisture trapped inside the ancient limestone turned to steam instantly, and the stones burst like grenades. This brings us to the word sanctuary. A sanctuary is a place of refuge or safety. The people sought sanctuary in the church. They believed the stone walls provided sanctuary. But on that Tuesday night, the concept of sanctuary died. The scaffolding around the cathedral, made of dry timber, caught fire first. The flames climbed up the walls, reaching the roof. And the roof of St. Paul's was not made of slate or tile. It was made of lead. 6 acres of lead sheeting. Lead has a low melting point relative to other metals. As the fire raged, the roof began to liquefy. Molten is the adjective we use for metal or rock that has been liquefied by heat. Molten lead dripped from the roof. The street was blocked by a stream of molten metal. Eyewitnesses described a horrific sight. A river of molten lead pouring down Ludgate Hill. It flowed through the streets like water, consuming everything in its path. It was a scene from a nightmare, or perhaps a scene from hell. And underneath this molten roof lay the tragedy of the books. Recall that the stationers and booksellers had filled the crypt of St. Faith's, the church beneath the cathedral, with their entire stock. They had sealed the heavy doors. They thought the books were safe. But the heat was so intense that it penetrated the stone floor. The lead rained down. The crypt became an oven. The books did not just burn, they incinerated. To incinerate means to destroy something by burning. The intense heat incinerated the library. The documents were incinerated instantly. When the roof collapsed, the rush of air fed the flames in the crypt. The literary history of an entire generation, plays, poems, theology, records, was turned to ash in seconds. This was an irretrievable loss. Irretrievable means not able to be retrieved or put right. The loss of the manuscripts was irretrievable. By Wednesday morning, the great silhouette of St. Paul's, which had dominated the London skyline for centuries, was a hollow, smoking shell. The psychological blow to the Londoners was immense. If God's house could burn, what hope did a baker have? The panic was absolute. The king, Charles II, finally realized that buckets of water and hand-pumped engines were useless against a fire of this magnitude. He decided to use the only tool left: gunpowder. This is a drastic measure. Drastic means likely to have a strong or far-reaching effect, radical and extreme. They took drastic measures to stop the spread. The situation called for a drastic solution. The king ordered the navy to bring gunpowder from the Tower of London. They did not use it to fight the fire directly. They used it to fight the fuel. They blew up entire rows of houses before the fire could reach them. Boom, boom, boom. The explosions terrified the already traumatized citizens. Many thought the French had finally invaded and were shelling the city. The rumors of war, the fear we spoke of earlier, made the solution sound like the problem. But the strategy worked. By demolishing the houses, they created a wide, empty space where there was no wood to burn. A true fire break. Then, the final piece of luck arrived. The wind dropped. On Wednesday evening, the gale that had whipped the fire into a frenzy suddenly died down. The fire, starved of fuel by the gunpowder and starved of oxygen by the calm air, began to falter. To falter means to start to lose strength or momentum. The fire began to falter as the wind died. His courage faltered when he saw the destruction. Thursday morning dawned on a silence that was louder than the roar. The fire was out, but the city was gone. 80% of the city of London was destroyed. 13,000 houses, 87 churches, the Royal Exchange, the Custom House, the prisons, the gates, all gone. The people wandered through the smoking ruins, their faces black with soot, their eyes wide with shock. The landmarks they used to navigate their lives, "Turn left at the grocer's," "Meet me by the pump," had vanished. They were lost in their own home. This feeling is called disorientation. Disorientation is a state of mental confusion as to time, place, or identity. The destruction of the landmarks caused a sense of disorientation. He felt a profound disorientation walking through the ruins. But amidst the disorientation, the old habits of fear returned. The fire was out, but the anger was burning. Who did this? The mob found a man, a simple-minded French watchmaker named Robert Hubert. He was confused. He was likely mentally ill. And under pressure, perhaps seeking attention or simply not understanding the question, he confessed. To confess means to admit that one has committed a crime or is at fault in some way. He confessed to starting the fire. The confession was likely coerced. Hubert claimed he threw a fireball into the bakery. It was a lie. He wasn't even in London when the fire started. He was on a ship in the North Sea. The captain of the ship could prove it. But the mob didn't want proof. They wanted a scapegoat. They wanted an explanation that made sense. A baker made a mistake is terrifying because it means we are vulnerable to accidents. A Frenchman attacked us is comforting because it means we have an enemy we can fight. So, despite the evidence, Robert Hubert was tried. The jury, driven by fear and prejudice, found him guilty. He was hanged at Tyburn, a man killed not by the fire, but by the fear of it. This brings us to the aftermath. The smoke cleared, but the questions remained. How do you rebuild a city that has been leveled? How do you house 100,000 homeless people before winter comes? And most importantly, how do you prevent this from ever happening again? The answers to these questions would change the English language, the English city, and the very concept of insurance forever. London was about to be reborn. But first, it had to survive the winter in the ashes. When the smoke finally cleared in late September 1666, Londoners looked out over a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon. 436 acres of ash. The landmarks were gone. The horizon was flat. We use the word desolation to describe this state. The desolation of the city was absolute. He walked through the desolation, recognizing nothing. In the fields of Moorfields and Islington, just north of the city, 100,000 people were camping in tents and shacks. They were the displaced. Displaced refers to people who are forced to leave their home, typically because of war, persecution, or natural disaster. The government struggled to house the displaced population. Winter was coming, and with the king's treasury empty and the city's trade halted, there was a risk of rebellion. Fear, which had traveled so fast during the plague and the fire, was now turning into anger. The people needed a plan. Enter the architects. Specifically, Sir Christopher Wren and John Evelyn. They looked at the desolation and saw a blank canvas. They drew up plans for a new London, a city of wide, straight boulevards, Italian piazzas, and geometric beauty. They wanted to erase the medieval maze that had trapped the plague and the fire. They wanted a modern, rational city. Rational means based on or in accordance with reason or logic. Wren proposed a rational layout for the streets. But they forgot one thing: property rights. The shopkeepers and merchants did not want a piazza. They wanted their shop back, exactly where it was. They knew their customers by the location. The third door on the left was their address. If you moved the street, you destroyed their business. This led to a compromise. A compromise is an agreement reached by each side making concessions. The final plan was a compromise between the grand vision and the property owner's demands. The compromise was this: The streets would stay mostly where they were, but they would be wider, and crucially, the materials would change. The Rebuilding Act of 1667 was passed. It is one of the most important laws in London's history. It stated a simple, non-negotiable rule: no more wood. All new houses had to be built of brick or stone. The walls had to be a certain thickness. The streets had to be wide enough to prevent fire from jumping across. Non-negotiable means not open to discussion or modification. The use of brick was non-negotiable. This transformed London from a city of timber to a city of red brick. It killed the rats' habitats, straw roofs and wooden walls, without even meaning to. The fire, in its violence, had sterilized the city. But brick costs money, and fear, as we have learned, is a powerful motivator. A man named Nicholas Barbon saw an opportunity in this fear. He realized that people were terrified of losing everything again, so he invented a product to sell them: insurance. Before 1666, if your house burned down, you relied on charity. Barbon changed that. He set up the fire office. You paid him a small amount every year, a premium, and if your house burned, he paid to rebuild it. Premium, in this context, is an amount to be paid for an insurance policy. He paid a high premium because his house was near a bakery. To prove you had paid, they nailed a metal plaque, a fire mark, to the front of your house. If the fire officer's private fire brigade arrived and saw their mark, they would put out the fire. If they didn't see the mark, well, sometimes they would just watch it burn. This is the beginning of the modern financial system. It is the monetization of risk. Monetization is the action or process of earning revenue from an asset, business, etc. The insurance industry is the monetization of fear. As the city rose from the ashes, a new skyline emerged. It was dominated not by the jagged timber gables of the past, but by the clean lines of brick and the white stone of Christopher Wren's new churches. And rising above them all was the new St. Paul's Cathedral, a giant dome that would watch over the city for centuries. But the city also needed to remember. It needed a symbol of the disaster. So they built the monument. It is a simple name for a massive Doric column, 202 feet tall, standing exactly 202 feet from where the fire started in Pudding Lane. It is a scar made of stone. To commemorate means to recall and show respect for someone or something. The statue commemorates the victims of the war. The monument commemorates the Great Fire. However, even in stone, the fear and the lies persisted. For over 150 years, the inscription on the base of the monument did not blame the baker. It blamed the treachery and malice of the popish faction. It blamed the Catholics. Treachery means betrayal of trust, deceptive action or nature. The inscription falsely accused them of treachery. It was a lie carved into the very heart of the city. It was the official narrative, solidified in rock. It taught generations of Londoners to hate their Catholic neighbors, using the fire as justification. It wasn't until 1830 that the lie was chiseled off. This teaches us a profound lesson about history. The event happens once, but the story of the event changes depending on who holds the chisel. Subjective means based on or influenced by personal feelings, tastes, or opinions. History is often subjective. The narrative on the monument was highly subjective. By the 1670s, London was back. It was cleaner. It was wider. It was richer. The plague never returned in a major epidemic. The fire never consumed the city again. But the fear had not vanished. It had just changed shape. It had moved from the whispers of the market to the contracts of the insurance brokers. It had moved from the superstition of the searchers to the statistics of the actuaries. The city had learned to manage its fear. It had learned to build walls against it. As we approach the end of our journey, we must ask, what did this double tragedy, plague and fire, actually teach us? Did it make us wiser? Or did it just make us better at hiding the danger? The answer lies in the legacy that these events left behind. A legacy that is still written in the laws, the language, and the streets we walk today. When you stand in front of St. Paul's Cathedral today, you are not looking at a medieval church. You are looking at a monument to a new way of thinking. The stone is white. The dome is mathematical. It is a building designed to survive the apocalypse. London did not just rebuild, it reinvented itself. The Great Fire of 1666, ironically, helped end the Great Plague of 1665. This is a controversial historical theory, but many historians argue that the fire sterilized the city. It burned down the filthy, rat-infested wooden slums. It destroyed the breeding grounds of the fleas. The fire, in its indiscriminate fury, inadvertently sanitized the capital. We use the word inadvertent to describe this. Inadvertent means not resulting from or achieved through deliberate planning. The fire had the inadvertent effect of stopping the disease. The cure was an inadvertent result of the disaster. This brings us to the final lesson of our journey: transformation. Transformation is a thorough or dramatic change in form or appearance. The transformation of London from a wooden city to a brick city was total. The city that rose from the ashes was safer, wider, and cleaner. But the psychological scars remained. The people of London had learned that their world was fragile. They had learned that an invisible germ could kill their family, and a simple spark could destroy their home. They had also learned that information, the rumors, the whispers, the informal messengers, could be just as dangerous as the threat itself. In 1665, the rumor that the Dutch poisoned the wells caused violence. In 1666, the rumor that Frenchmen were throwing fireballs caused panic. Does this sound familiar? Today, we live in a world where information travels instantly. We do not have coffee houses and market squares. We have the internet. But the mechanism of fear is exactly the same. We still look for scapegoats. We still seek explanations to feel control. And we still struggle to distinguish between a fact and a fabrication. Fabrication is the action or process of inventing something, typically with deceitful intent. The story about the foreign spies was a total fabrication. He admitted the evidence was a fabrication. So, as English learners and students of history, how do we navigate this? We use the tools we have practiced throughout this series. We use cautious language. When you hear a sensational claim, do not say, "This is true." Say, "Reports suggest that," or "It is alleged that." When you see a statistic that looks too perfect, do not say, "This proves it." Say, "There is a discrepancy in the data." By using these words, alleged, suggests, appears, verify, you are building a mental firebreak. You are stopping the wildfire of misinformation from spreading through you. You are becoming a critical thinker in English. The London of 1666 is gone, but the human nature that inhabited it remains. We are still afraid of the dark. We are still afraid of the sick. And we are still prone to believing the loudest voice in the room. But if history teaches us anything, it is that resilience is real. London survived. The people returned. They swept up the ash, they buried the dead, and they laid new bricks. They wrote new laws. They created insurance. They built a city that would become the financial capital of the world. The fear traveled fast, but the recovery, though slow, was permanent. Thank you for walking these smoky streets with the London Gritty Chronicles. You have learned the vocabulary of crisis, from quarantine and draconian to resilience and transformation. You have learned how to report the magnitude of a disaster and how to identify a scapegoat. Keep these words in your pocket. You never know when you might need to describe a world that is changing faster than you can explain. The fire is out. The plague has passed. But the story continues with you.